Hello and welcome to this mini lecture on Australia. My name is David Marler from Rotterdam University of Applied Sciences, and today we're going to discuss Australia for the Culture and Literature 1.2 course. We're going to start with a few quick facts about Australia. It has a population of 25 million people. The first Europeans to discover Australia, or to land in Australia more appropriately, were the Dutch. It is a large foreign-born population. 28% of the people in Australia were born in another country. The capital is Canberra, between Melbourne and Sydney, and it has large amounts of marsupials. As you've read in the book, koalas and kangaroos. Marsupials, of course, are mammals with pouches. We're going to talk now about the people of Australia. The Indigenous people of Australia are often referred to as the Aborigines or Aboriginals. Indigenous people came across from the continent of Australia, while the Torres Strait Islanders come from a group of small islands in northeast of Australia. Before European settlement, there were hundreds of distinct Indigenous languages in the country. Indigenous worldviews are shaped by the dreaming, a spiritual concept that refers to a time when ancestral beings traveled across Australia, creating landscapes and geographic features, as well as human society and its rules for living, language, and customs. Despite a historical view from Europeans which claimed that Australia was terra nullius, or empty land, when the colonists first arrived, and that the indigenous people were wandering hunter-gatherers, some have recently begun to discover the sophisticated land and water management practices and semi-permanent villages pre-colonization. You can see on this map of Australia where the Torres Strait is. That's on the very top peninsula part of Australia. And you can also see the various groups of Indigenous peoples and Indigenous languages throughout Australia. An important part to look at is where Jigalong is. That is in the western part of Australia. And that is where the film that you had to watch for this course, Rabbit Proof Fence, takes place. Now, when we move on to the first Europeans to arrive, we can come to the Duifken that arrived in Australia. Now, the Dutch East India Company ship Duifken was led by Willem Janszoon, and he made the first documented European landing in Australia in 1606. But it must be noted that the Portuguese were there around the same time, and it was namely the Portuguese navigator Pedro Fernandes de Queiroz who had landed there and who had given it a name that we still use today. In Portuguese, that was Australia del Espírito Santo, which means southern land of the Holy Spirit, or at least I hope so, despite my horrible pronunciation in Portuguese. Until about 1788, the Europeans had very little interest in Australia. When the Dutch had came, they had left because the Dutch were mainly interested in resources that they could trade. And in 1788, Captain Arthur Phillip landed and began the process of turning Australia into a penal colony. Now, between 1788 and 1868, approximately 161,700 convicts, of whom about 25,000 of them were women, were transported to New South Wales, Van Diemen's Land, and Western Australia. Now, we believe that about two-thirds of these people were thieves from the Midlands and the north of England, and they were primarily from working-class towns. They were repeat offenders. But it is also important to know that there were a lot of Irish convicts that were transported to Australia primarily for political crimes or social rebellions. And this meant that the British had restricted the practice of Catholicism in Australia. And it also served for there to be a type of apprehension with regards to Catholicism. Australia Day is the national holiday, and it celebrates this British presence in Australia. However, to many of the Aboriginal people, it's referred to as Invasion Day because it is a day that celebrates the beginning of the invasion of European peoples into Australia. Much related to Australia as a penal colony is Norfolk Island. Now, as a penal colony, Australia was a place of last resort for British prisoners. However, this provided local prison officials with a problem. How could convicts already in Australia be deterred from committing further crime? Their solution was Norfolk Island, east of Australia in the Pacific Ocean, and this was set up as just a place for that. Norfolk Island did not hold many convicts, but it was absolutely essential to the British penal system. Punishments on Norfolk Island were purposefully cruel and designed to break both body and spirit. Rations were extremely limited, and there were never enough food or utensils for everyone, so prisoners were forced to squabble and eat from their hands. Here, all pretense of reform was abolished, and death was the only escape. Prisoners devised their own ritualistic forms of murder-suicide in order to be freed from this misery. We're now going to look at some important figures in Australian society. The first one that you'll see is Sir Donald Bradman, and he was born in 1908, and he is a very famous cricketer. He had a batting average of 99.94 and has been named as one of the best cricketers of all time. The second one is Eddie Mabo. Eddie Mabo was an Indigenous man born in 1936 on the island of Mare in the Torres Straits. Mabo was a key plaintiff in a land rights case in the High Court of Australia, today referred to as the Mabo case, which gave Indigenous Australians the ability to obtain legal ownership of their traditional lands. The next important person that we have is Australia's first saint, St. Mary MacKillop, and in 1866, together with a local parish, MacKillop opened a Catholic school in the rural southern Australia. The following year, MacKillop worked with the same priest to open Australia's first order of nuns, the Sisters of St. Joseph of Sacred Heart, also known as the Josephites. And the Josephites, of course, wore a plain brown habit and emphasized dedication to the poor and no personal ownership of goods. MacKillop died in 1909 and was canonized as a saint on October 17th in 2010. Another important Australian is Australia's first female Prime Minister, Julia Gillard. Julia Gillard became Australia's first female prime minister in June of 2010 and remained in this role for 3 years. She's probably best known for her tirade against opposition leader Tony Abbott, in which she famously said, "I will not be lectured about sexism and misogyny by this man." We're going to look a little bit now at Australia's policies. Now, one of them is the White Australia policy, and this term, the White Australia policy, was widely used to encapsulate a set of historical policies that aim to forbid people of non-European ethnic origin, specifically the Chinese and Malaysians or Asians and Pacific Islanders, from immigrating to Australia. The government has progressively dismantled these policies between 1949 and 1973. But some of them still exist today, such as very strict language tests. Another policy that we'd like to look at is the Tampa affair, and the Tampa is a Norwegian ship that rescued hundreds of asylum seekers from a sinking people-smuggling vessel in the Indian Ocean. The controversial movement of this vessel was hotly followed by Australian media over the several days it lingered unlawfully close to Australian waters. All eyes were on this ship filled with desperate people, conflicting orders, and dwindling onboard food and supplies. Just prior to the Tampa disaster, Australian opinion was already inflamed. In the week leading up to the rescue of the asylum seekers by the Tampa, over 1,500 people had landed in Australia seeking refuge status. The Tampa was purported to carry the most number of asylum seekers destined for Australia in recent history. 438 people were on board, mostly men from Afghanistan. Each of these asylum seekers is reported to have paid people smugglers in Indonesia up to 20,000 Australian dollars to get them into Australia. This led to what was called the Pacific Solution, and in response to what was seen as an influx of asylum seekers arrivals by boat, the Pacific Solution was central policy to the Liberal Party, and purportedly one of the major reasons for their success in winning the 2001 elections. The new Liberal government vowed to stop the boats and thus end deaths at sea. This government situated themselves as compassionate yet strong, stopping off unworthy sea boats filled to the brim with asylum seekers was a way of dissuading vulnerable people to take the dangerous sea journey to Australia. But it was also seen as a way of stopping gangs of people smugglers who preyed on desperate asylum seekers. Currently, the Pacific Solution means that Australia has an agreement with different countries. One of them is the PNG, or Papua New Guinea, and the other is Nauru. Essentially, any person who asks for asylum is often sent to these islands. On the picture, you can see all of Nauru, and they stay there for years. Many of them are there 3 years or more. Now, this is the end of this very short lecture on Australia, and you can read more about it in your textbook. Thanks for listening.